The radio crackled with static at 2:47 hours, breaking the suffocating silence that had settled over Firebase Omega like a death shroud. Lieutenant Commander Marcus, Reaper, Kozlov pressed his earpiece deeper, straining to catch the fragmentary transmission bleeding through the interference. What he heard made his blood freeze in his veins. Mayday, Mayday, Bravo 7 Actual, coordinates 32.4 and 68.7 E, 8 souls, ammunition critical, request immediate extract. Then nothing, dead air that stretched like an open grave. Kozlov's weathered hands trembled as he traced the coordinates on his tactical map. The numbers placed the distress call deep in the Kandahar Valley, a maze of razor-sharp ridgelines and Taliban strongholds that had swallowed entire units without leaving so much as dog tags behind. No Allied forces were supposed to be operating in that sector. The area had been declared a no-fly zone after 3 Apache gunships vanished into the mountain mist 6 months earlier. "Sir, that transmission. It's impossible," whispered Staff Sergeant Riley, his young face pale in the green glow of the communications equipment. "Command pulled all assets from that grid square after Operation Blackout went sideways." Kozlov's jaw tightened. Operation Blackout, the classified mission that had gone so catastrophically wrong that Pentagon brass still woke up screaming about it. 8 Navy SEALs had inserted into those same coordinates to neutralize a high-value target. They never came back. The official report listed them as KIA, but no bodies were ever recovered. The families received folded flags and hollow condolences. But someone was out there, someone who knew the proper radio protocols, someone who was very much alive and very much in trouble. The Firebase's commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, materialized from the shadows like a specter. His eyes, bloodshot from weeks of sleepless nights, fixed on the radio with the intensity of a sniper's scope. "You didn't hear anything, gentlemen. That frequency is classified beyond your clearance level." "But sir, if there are Americans—" "There are no Americans in that sector." Harrison's voice carried the finality of a coffin lid slamming shut. "The mountains play tricks on radio waves, makes you hear ghosts." Yet as thunder rolled across the Hindu Kush peaks, Kozlov couldn't shake the feeling that those ghosts were about to become very real. Somewhere in the darkness, beyond the reach of official channels and military protocol, a desperate countdown had begun. The question wasn't whether someone would answer that call for help. The question was who would be brave enough or foolish enough to try. Captain Alina, Vortex, Rashkova stood in the cavernous hangar bay of Bagram Airfield, her calloused hands running along the battle-scarred fuselage of the C-130 Hercules that had become both her salvation and her curse. The aircraft bore the scars of 100 missions over Afghanistan's unforgiving terrain, bullet holes patched with aluminum, burn marks from near misses with RPGs, and a spiderweb crack across the cockpit window that maintenance kept promising to fix. The other pilots called her aircraft the flying coffin behind her back, though never to her face. Not anymore. Not since she'd proven that coffins could fly straight through hell and emerge with their cargo intact. Alina's fingers traced the small metal placard riveted beneath the pilot's window. Maj. David Rashkov, KIA 15 Oct 2019. Her husband's memorial, installed against regulation but tolerated by commanders who understood that some rules mattered less than the human heart. David had died in these same mountains, his F-16 consumed by a surface-to-air missile while providing close air support to trapped Marines. Another sleepless night, Vortex. The voice belonged to Captain James "Iceberg" Kowalski, her co-pilot and the only man brave enough to fly into the teeth of hell with a woman the brass considered a liability. His Polish accent carried notes of concern wrapped in forced casualness. "The radio intercept from Firebase Omega," Alina said without turning around. "You heard it too, didn't you?" James's silence stretched long enough to confirm her suspicions. The transmission had been broadcast on emergency frequencies, but officially, it had never happened. The military machine had a way of making inconvenient truths disappear into classified file cabinets. Command says it was atmospheric interference, solar flares playing with the ionosphere. James's tone suggested he believed those explanations about as much as he believed in unicorns. Alina finally turned, her green eyes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights like chips of Arctic ice. 8 souls, James. 8 Americans who might still be breathing while we debate atmospheric phenomena. Alina. James's use of her real name instead of her call sign carried the weight of years flying together through impossible odds. You know what happened to the last crew that went looking for phantoms in those mountains? They never came back. She nodded toward the memorial placard. David never came back either, but he tried. That's what we do, we try. The hangar fell silent except for the distant hum of generators and the whispered conversations of night shift mechanics. Alina closed her eyes and could almost hear David's voice from their last conversation, crackling through a satellite phone connection from a forward operating base. Promise me something, Elle. If I don't make it home, don't let them ground you. The sky needs pilots who remember why we fly. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the Hindu Kush like an army of shadows. The morning briefing at 600 hours carried the stale taste of recycled air and bitter coffee that had been brewing since midnight. Colonel Patricia, Iron Lady, Montgomery stood at the head of the table, her silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun that could have been carved from granite. The assembled aircrew, 12 pilots who represented the backbone of tactical airlift operations in Afghanistan, sat in rigid attention. Gentlemen and lady, Montgomery's gaze lingered on Alina with barely concealed disapproval. We have reports of increased Taliban activity in the Kandahar Valley. All flights into Sector 77 are suspended until further notice. Alina's pen stopped moving across her notepad. Sector 77, the exact coordinates from the Ghost transmission. Colonel, what about search and rescue protocols, if there are personnel? Captain Rashkova, Montgomery's voice could have flash-frozen jet fuel. There are no personnel in that sector. Any suggestion otherwise borders on insubordination. The room's atmosphere grew thick enough to choke on. Alina felt the weight of a dozen stares, some sympathetic, others calculating the distance they needed to maintain from a pilot whose career was balanced on a knife's edge. She'd been walking that edge since David's death, when grief had made her reckless and command had made her expendable. Major Thunderbolt Rodriguez, a veteran pilot with more combat hours than the rest of the squadron combined, leaned forward. Ma'am, hypothetically speaking, if there were American assets in distress. There are not. Montgomery's words fell like hammer blows. This briefing is concluded, dismissed. The pilots filed out in subdued silence, but Alina remained seated, her eyes fixed on the sectional chart spread across the briefing table. The Forbidden Zone stared back at her, a maze of 10,000-foot peaks and box canyons where aircraft went to die. Captain, Montgomery's voice had shifted to a tone Alina recognized from her own mother, disappointment wrapped in duty. You're a gifted pilot. Don't throw your career away chasing echoes. Alina stood slowly, her 5'4" frame dwarfed by the imposing colonel but her spine straight as a steel rod. With respect, ma'am, some echoes are worth chasing. Montgomery studied her for a long moment, seeing something in Alina's eyes that made her own expression soften almost imperceptibly. Your husband died a hero, Captain. Don't die a fool. As Alina walked toward the hangar, her mind was already calculating fuel loads, weather patterns, and the narrow window of opportunity that might exist between radar sweeps. Behind her, she didn't see Montgomery reach for her secure phone. The call would never appear in official logs. Alina's C-130 sat in the pre-dawn darkness like a sleeping giant, its 4 turboprops silent and still. The aircraft's designation was painted in faded gray letters across the nose, 395782 Spirit of Warsaw. The name honored James's grandfather, who had flown bombers over Nazi-occupied Europe with the same stubborn courage that now ran in his grandson's veins. James emerged from the aircraft's cargo bay, his flight suit already dark with sweat despite the cool mountain air. Pre-flight's complete, all systems green, but Alina, if we do this, we'll be violating direct orders, risking court-martial and probably getting ourselves killed. Alina's voice carried no trace of doubt. I know. Then why? Alina pulled the crumpled frequency log from her pocket, the same paper where she'd written down the ghost transmission's coordinates. Because 8 months ago, David's squadron received a distress call from a downed pilot. The weather was shit, Taliban forces were closing in, and command said it was too risky. David went anyway. James remembered that mission. The pilot they'd rescued had been a young Marine whose FA-18 had taken a golden BB in the engine over Helmand Province. David had flown through a thunderstorm and surface-to-air fire to pull him out. 3 weeks later, that same Marine had written a letter to David's unit. The rescued pilot had a 6-month-old daughter he'd never met. That Marine's daughter took her first steps while her father was home instead of in a Taliban prison camp. Alina continued. David used to say that sometimes the math of war isn't about odds or protocols. Sometimes it's about being the person who answers when someone calls for help. The first pale fingers of dawn were reaching across the airfield, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. In that light, Alina looked younger than her 32 years, but her eyes held the weight of loss that aged souls beyond their time. So we're really doing this, James said. It wasn't a question. We're really doing this. Alina climbed toward the cockpit, pausing at the top of the ladder. James, if we don't come back. We will. His certainty surprised them both. Because David's watching, and he'd never forgive us if we let his wife become a widow twice. Alina smiled, the first genuine smile James had seen from her in months. Then let's go wake up some ghosts. The engine spooled to life, with a thunderous roar that shook the hangar walls. The C-130's engines settled into their familiar rhythm, as Alina guided the aircraft through pre-takeoff checks with the precision of a surgeon and the instincts of a predator. Each switch, each gauge, each system responded to her touch with the intimate familiarity of an old marriage. This aircraft had carried her through sandstorms over Iraq, monsoons over the Philippines, and the crushing darkness of night insertions where failure meant death for soldiers depending on her precision. Tower, this is Hammer 79 requesting clearance for routine cargo run to Fob Shank. Alina's voice carried the bored professionalism of 100 similar requests. The lie rolled off her tongue with the smoothness of years spent navigating military bureaucracy. Hammer 79, you're cleared for departure. Runway 27, winds calm, safe flight. The irony wasn't lost on either pilot. Nothing about their intended destination could be considered safe by any reasonable definition. As the C-130 lifted off from Bagram's runway, Alina felt the familiar sensation of gravity releasing its hold, the moment when thousands of pounds of aluminum and steel defied the Earth's pull through nothing more than physics and human will. Below them, Afghanistan spread out like a topographical map of human ambition and folly, forward operating bases scattered like lonely islands in an ocean of hostile terrain. Course heading 270, James called out, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. Fuel burn nominal. Weather report shows clear skies for the next 4 hours. Alina banked the aircraft toward the mountains, feeling the subtle shift in air pressure as they climbed toward the peaks that had claimed so many aircrew before them. The Kandahar Valley lay ahead, a natural fortress that had broken the will of empires from Alexander the Great to the Soviet Union. Contact, 2 F-16s at our 6 o'clock, climbing fast. James's voice tightened with concern. Alina's blood turned to ice water. Fighter aircraft meant someone had noticed their deviation from the flight plan. In the military's rigid hierarchy, curiosity could be as dangerous as enemy fire. Hammer 79, this is Falcon Lead. You appear to be off your filed flight path. Please explain your intentions. The voice belonged to Major Rebecca Snake Voss, a pilot Alina knew from flight school. Rebecca was career Air Force, ambitious and unforgiving, the kind of officer who saw regulations as sacred scripture. Alina keyed her microphone. Falcon Lead, we're investigating an atmospheric anomaly, standard weather reconnaissance. Negative, Hammer 79. Return to your filed flight plan immediately. That area is restricted. Through her headset, Alina could hear the subtle change in engine pitch that meant the F-16s were moving into intercept position. They had minutes before this became an international incident. The radio burst to life with a transmission that made Alina's heart stop. Any station, any station. This is Bravo 7 Actual. We have wounded. Request immediate medical evacuation. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only static and the thunderous silence of two F-16s closing in from behind. Alina looked at James, seeing her own desperate resolve reflected in his eyes. They were committed now. There was no turning back from the choice that would define the rest of their lives, however long those lives might be. The mountains loomed ahead like the gates of hell, and somewhere in their shadows, 8 American voices were calling for help through the darkness. The F-16s flanked Alina's C-130 with the precise choreography of aerial ballet, their sleek forms cutting through the morning air like silver bullets. Through her cockpit window, Alina could see Major Voss in the lead fighter, her helmet turning toward the cargo plane with the mechanical precision of a predator studying its prey. Hammer 79, you will adjust heading to 090 and return to base immediately. This is not a request. Voss's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. Alina's thumb hovered over the radio transmit button. Protocol demanded compliance. Military law required it. But somewhere below in the serrated landscape of the Kandahar Valley, American soldiers were dying while bureaucrats shuffled papers and covered their asses. James, how long until we reach the coordinates? 12 minutes at current speed. His voice was steady, but Alina could see the tension in his white-knuckled grip on the yoke. The ghost transmission crackled again, weaker this time. Taliban forces, overrun, need immediate. Major Voss's F-16 pulled closer, near enough that Alina could see the pilot's face mask and the weapon's pylons bristling with air-to-air missiles. The unspoken threat hung in the air between them like a blade poised to fall. Alina. James's voice carried a note she'd never heard before, not fear, but something deeper, resignation mixed with pride. My grandfather used to tell stories about Polish pilots in World War II. They'd break formation, ignore orders, go after German bombers even when outnumbered 10-1. Did they survive? Most didn't, but they saved London. Alina closed her eyes for a heartbeat, feeling David's presence in the co-pilot seat where James now sat. She could almost hear her husband's voice, calm and sure. Do what's right, Elle. The rest is just paperwork. When she opened her eyes, the decision was made. Falcon Lead, this is Hammer 79. Alina's voice carried a new quality, the quiet certainty of a woman who had found her purpose. I have American soldiers in distress. I'm going to get them. Hammer 79, if you proceed, I'm authorized to use force to prevent breach of restricted airspace. The threat hung between them like a loaded gun. Alina looked down at David's memorial placard, then at James, whose slight nod told her everything she needed to know. Then you'll have to shoot down an American aircraft trying to save American lives. Alina pushed the throttles forward, feeling the C-130's engines surge with power. Good luck explaining that to the families. The F-16s fell back slightly, their pilots faced with an impossible choice no military training could have prepared them for. Major Voss's voice came through the radio, different now, uncertain, almost human. Hammer 7-9. Alina, don't make me do this. Alina's response was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. Then don't. The C-130 plunged toward the mountains, leaving the F-16s circling in the thin air above like metallic vultures. Alina felt the familiar sensation of flying alone into the unknown, where the only compass was conscience and the only map was hope. Below them, the Kandahar Valley opened like a mouth full of teeth, ready to swallow another aircraft whole. But for the first time in 8 months, Elena Rashkova was exactly where she belonged. The terrain radar painted a picture of geological violence, jagged peaks that clawed at the sky like the fingers of buried giants. Elena threaded the C-130 between ridgelines that rose on either side like cathedral walls, the aircraft's wings clearing rocky outcroppings by margins measured in feet rather than hundreds of yards. Terrain, terrain, pull up. The automated warning system chanted with electronic urgency, but Alina's hands remained steady on the controls. She'd learned to fly in these mountains, had memorized every wind current and thermal updraft during countless missions that never appeared in official logs. "Alina, we're below minimum safe altitude," James called out, his voice tight with professional concern. The altimeter showed 8,200 feet, but the peaks around them soared past 12,000. They were flying through a landscape that could kill them with one moment of inattention. "Minimum safe altitude is a luxury we can't afford." Alina banked hard left, following a narrow valley that snaked deeper into Taliban territory. Those soldiers don't have time for safety margins. The radio crackled again, stronger now. "Any station. This is Bravo 7 actual. We have multiple wounded. Taliban closing our position. If anyone can hear this." Alina keyed her microphone. "Bravo 7 actual, this is Hammer 7-9. We hear you. Transmit your exact position." Silence stretched for an eternity before a voice responded, young, desperate, tinged with disbelief. "Hammer 7-9. Did you say you're en route to our position?" "That's affirmative, Bravo 7. We're 12 minutes out. Can you provide landing zone assessment?" Jesus Christ, we thought. Command said no air support was coming. The voice broke slightly, the sound of hope being reborn in the throat of someone who had prepared to die forgotten. James pulled up tactical maps on his display, his experienced eyes scanning for anything resembling a landing zone. What he found made his stomach drop. "Alina, there's nowhere to land. The entire valley is vertical rock faces and boulder fields." Alina studied the terrain herself, her mind automatically calculating approach angles and touchdown zones, with the instincts of a pilot who had landed in impossible places before. There, a narrow strip of relatively flat ground beside a dried riverbed, maybe 1,200 feet long and barely wide enough for the C-130's wingspan. There, she pointed, that clearing. James squinted through his binoculars. "That's not a clearing, that's a death trap. The approach angle is too steep, the surface is uneven, and if we get stuck down there, then we'll be stuck with 8 American soldiers, instead of flying home without them." The landscape below them told stories of countless battles, burned-out vehicle hulks, craters from artillery strikes, and the skeletal remains of aircraft that had dared to challenge these mountains. Each wreck served as a monument to the hubris of thinking machines could conquer terrain that had humbled warriors for millennia. But Alina had learned something in these mountains that no flight manual could teach. Sometimes survival wasn't about following rules. Sometimes it was about writing new ones. The valley narrowed ahead, forcing Alina to reduce airspeed and drop altitude until the C-130 was skimming the rocky walls like a metal bird, following an ancient migration route. The sound of her engines echoed off stone faces, announcing their presence to anyone with ears to hear, including the Taliban fighters who were undoubtedly watching from concealed positions, fingers on triggers, waiting for the perfect shot. Bravo 7 Actual, this is Hammer 79. We have visual on your general location. Pop smoke to mark your position. Roger, Hammer 79, popping smoke now. A thin column of green smoke rose from the valley floor like a prayer made visible, marking not just a landing zone, but the location where 8 American soldiers had decided to trust their lives to a pilot they'd never met, flying an aircraft that had no business attempting a landing in such terrain. Alina began her descent, feeling the C-130 respond to her inputs with the familiar solidarity of a war machine that had never let her down. The smoke grew larger in her windscreen, and with it, the magnitude of what she was attempting. The C-130's landing gear extended with mechanical groans that sounded like the aircraft itself questioning the sanity of its pilot. Alina maintained a descent rate that would have made flight instructors weep. Too steep, too fast, but the only approach angle that wouldn't slam them into the valley walls. Bravo 7 Actual, we're on final approach. Be advised, this is going to be loud and ugly. Copy, Hammer 79. We're ready for anything that gets us out of here. James called out airspeed and altitude in a steady rhythm that anchored Alina to the present moment, preventing her mind from drifting to the 100 ways this landing could end in twisted metal and burning fuel. 120 knots, 800 feet above ground level. Rate of descent 1,200 feet per minute. The improvised landing zone rushed up toward them with terrifying speed. Alina could see the details now. Loose rocks that could shred tires, hidden depressions that could snap landing gear, and the unmistakable shapes of men in military gear crouched behind whatever cover they could find. 8 figures, exactly as reported. Jesus, they're really down there, James breathed. Alina reduced power, feeling the C-130 settle toward the rocky strip with all the grace of a falling piano. The main landing gear touched down with a bone-jarring impact that sent shock waves through the airframe, followed immediately by the nose gear slamming into terrain that felt more like concrete than earth. Reverse thrust, full reverse, Alina shouted over the shriek of protesting metal and rubber. The C-130 shuddered and bucked like a wild animal as James threw the propellers into reverse pitch, the engines screaming in protest as they fought to arrest the aircraft's forward momentum. Through the windscreen, Alina watched the end of the makeshift runway approaching with mathematical certainty. They weren't going to stop in time. Alina, James's voice carried the edge of panic as the valley wall loomed ahead. Alina stood on the brakes with every ounce of strength in her legs, feeling the anti-skid system pulse under her feet like a mechanical heartbeat. The aircraft's tires smoked and screamed against the rocky surface, leaving black streaks that would remain as testament to this moment long after they were gone. 50 feet from the wall, 40, 30. The C-130 lurched to a halt with 20 feet to spare, its nose pointing toward a rock face that would have turned them into scrap metal and bad memories. Alina's hands shook as she shut down the engines, the sudden silence broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant crack of rifle fire. Through the cargo bay, she could hear voices, American voices, alive and desperate and running toward their salvation. That, James said with the reverence of a man who had just witnessed a miracle, was either the worst landing in aviation history or the best. Alina smiled, feeling David's presence in the cockpit like a warm hand on her shoulder. Let's go get our boys. The cargo ramp lowered with hydraulic precision, revealing 8 figures that emerged from the morning shadows like specters given flesh. They moved with the distinctive gait of Special Operations Forces, controlled urgency wrapped in tactical awareness, even in exhaustion. The team leader approached with the measured stride of a man who had learned to expect disappointment but was afraid to hope for miracles. He was compact and weathered, with the kind of scars that came from places where combat wasn't theoretical. His name tape read TORRES. Ma'am, I'm Gunnery Sergeant Miguel Torres, SEAL Team 7. I don't know who authorized this extraction, but nobody authorized it, Gunny. Elena stepped down from the cockpit, her flight helmet tucked under her arm. Sometimes you have to write your own orders. Tor's expression shifted from gratitude to concern. Ma'am, if this isn't an official mission. It's official enough. Elena gestured toward the aircraft that had just accomplished the impossible. 8 American souls requested transportation. I'm providing transportation. The other SEALs began loading wounded teammates with the efficiency of professionals who had performed this ritual too many times. Elena could see the cost of their ordeal written in their faces, exhaustion that went deeper than sleep could cure, the hollow-eyed look of men who had stared death in the face and somehow convinced it to blink first. "How long have you been out there?" James asked, helping secure a stretcher inside the cargo bay. 8 months, replied a young SEAL whose left arm hung in an improvised sling. We were inserted for a 72-hour operation. Extract never came. 8 months. Elena's mind reeled at the implications. These weren't phantom voices or atmospheric anomalies. These were real soldiers who had been written off, abandoned, left to survive in hostile territory while their families received flag-draped coffins and empty condolences. What was the mission? Elena asked. Torres exchanged glances with his men, a silent communication that spoke of classified briefings and operations that existed in the gray zones between official acknowledgement and plausible deniability. High-value target elimination, Torres said finally. Taliban commander who'd been coordinating attacks on NATO supply convoys. We completed the mission, but the extraction helicopter took an RPG on approach. Crew didn't make it. Elena nodded, understanding flooding through her like cold water. These men hadn't just been abandoned, they'd been erased from official records to protect operational security. Dead men tell no tales, and phantom missions leave no paper trails. The distant sound of helicopter rotors echoed off the valley walls, growing stronger with each passing second. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the distinctive whop-whop-whop of Apache gunships. "Time to go," she called, sprinting toward the cockpit as the SEALs finished loading their wounded. But as the engine spooled to life, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were taking off into something far more dangerous than the landing had been. The Apache appeared over the ridgeline like mechanical wasps, their angular fuselages bristling with Hellfire missiles and 30 chain guns. Elena counted 4 aircraft in attack formation, more than enough firepower to reduce her C-130 to scattered debris across the valley floor. Hammer 7-9, this is Apache lead. You will shut down engines and await ground forces for escort back to base. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Reaper Walsh, a pilot whose reputation for following orders was exceeded only by her skill at eliminating targets. Elena's hands moved across the startup sequence with practiced speed, bringing the C-130 systems online while calculating takeoff distance against available runway. The math was unforgiving. They needed every foot of the rocky strip to achieve flying speed, and the Apache could end their takeoff attempt with a single missile. Apache lead, this is Hammer 7-9. Elena keyed her microphone. I have 8 American personnel aboard requiring immediate medical attention. Hammer 7-9, those personnel are classified KIA. You are interfering with a classified operation. KIA, killed in action. The bureaucratic euphemism that transformed living, breathing men into administrative footnotes. Elena felt rage building in her chest like pressure in a boiler. Apache lead, I'm looking at 8 very much alive American soldiers. Your intelligence appears to be outdated. Through her headset, Elena heard the subtle shift in tone that meant weapon systems were being armed. The Apache spread into attack formation, their stub wings heavy with ordnance designed to crack open armored vehicles. In the cargo bay, Tors pressed against the bulkhead separating the passenger compartment from the cockpit. "Captain, if this is about orders and classification levels, my team volunteers to remain behind. Don't risk your aircraft for ghosts." Alina turned in her seat, meeting the SEAL's eyes through the narrow opening. "Gunny, 8 months ago my husband died in these mountains providing close air support to Marines in trouble. Command called it a calculated risk. I called it murder by committee." Her voice carried the weight of months spent grieving a death that could have been prevented by courage instead of protocol. "Today, I choose differently." The C-130 began rolling forward, building speed across the rocky surface as Alina pushed the throttles to maximum power. The engines roared with mechanical fury, drowning out the Apache's increasingly urgent radio demands. "Hammer 79, abort takeoff immediately, or we will be forced to take action." Alina watched her airspeed indicator climb, 60 knots, 70, 80. She needed 120 for rotation speed, but the valley wall was approaching with mathematical certainty. "Sarah," Alina switched to Reaper's personal call sign, her voice carrying the intimacy of shared flight training and mutual respect. "You've got family, kids who need their mother to come home. Don't make today the day you explain to them why you shot down Americans." The silence stretched across the radio waves like a held breath. At 110 knots, Alina pulled back on the yoke, willing the C-130 into the air through sheer force of determination. The Apache gunships held their fire. The C-130 clawed its way into the thin mountain air with the determination of a machine that refused to acknowledge the laws of physics. Alina felt the familiar sensation of wings finding purchase in the atmosphere, transforming tons of aluminum and steel into something that belonged in the sky rather than scattered across the valley floor. Behind them, the Apache gunships followed at a distance that suggested professional reluctance rather than tactical pursuit. Alina knew Sarah Walsh was facing the same impossible choice that had confronted every pilot in this war, the choice between following orders and following conscience. "Apache lead to command, this is Reaper." Alina could hear Walsh's transmission on the emergency frequency. "Hammer 79 has departed the restricted zone with unidentified personnel, requesting instructions." The response from command came swift and cold. "Reaper, you will escort the C-130 back to Bagram and place the crew under arrest for violation of direct orders." Alina exchanged glances with James, both pilots understanding that their careers, and quite possibly their freedom, were measured in the remaining flight time to base. But in the cargo bay behind them, a Navy corpsman was working to stabilize wounded SEALs who had been written off as casualties 8 months ago. "Hammer 79, this is Bravo 7 Actual." Tor's voice came through the intercom, stronger now that medical supplies were flowing into his men. "I need you to know something about the mission that got us stranded." Alina adjusted course toward Bagram, keeping one eye on the Apache maintaining formation off her starboard wing. "Go ahead, Gunny." The high-value target we eliminated wasn't just coordinating supply convoy attacks. He was planning something bigger, much bigger. We recovered intelligence indicating a coordinated assault on every NATO base in Afghanistan, timed for the anniversary of 9/11. James's head snapped up from his navigation calculations. "That's 3 weeks away." "The intelligence is time-sensitive," Tors continued. "Names, dates, infiltration routes, weapon caches, everything needs to prevent what could be the largest coordinated attack since the war began." Alina felt the weight of revelation settling over the cockpit like lead blankets. These men hadn't just been abandoned. They'd been carrying intelligence that could save hundreds of lives, information that had been buried along with their official existence. "Why wasn't this reported through proper channels?" James asked. Tor's laugh carried no humor. "Because some of those names on the target list, they're not all Taliban." The implication hung in the air like toxic gas. Corruption, collaboration, the kind of ugly truths that made commanders nervous and politicians reach for damage control protocols. Hammer 79, this is Apache lead. Walsh's voice carried a new quality, uncertainty replacing authority. Command is ordering radio silence until we reach base. Alina understood the subtext. Someone powerful wanted this conversation to end before it revealed information that could embarrass the wrong people. The kind of people who could make helicopters crash and investigations disappear. Through her side window, Alina could see Bagram Airfield in the distance, its runways and hangars representing the intersection of salvation and judgment. In 30 minutes, she would either be a hero or a criminal, depending entirely on which version of the truth prevailed in classified briefing rooms. But for the first time since David's death, Alina felt like she was flying toward something worthwhile instead of running from her grief. The radio erupted with multiple voices as Bagram's tower controllers attempted to process the impossible sight of a C-130 cargo aircraft returning from a restricted zone under Apache escort, carrying passengers who officially didn't exist. Hammer 79, this is Bagram Tower. You are not cleared for landing. Proceed to holding pattern at 12,000 feet pending security clearance. Alina watched her fuel gauges with growing concern. The unscheduled detour to the Kandahar Valley had consumed reserves she couldn't afford to burn in endless circles above the airfield. Bagram Tower, I have wounded personnel aboard requiring immediate medical attention. Request priority landing clearance. Negative, Hammer 79. All runways are closed to your aircraft pending investigation. Through her headset, Alina heard the